In the last video, we looked at using motion to connect elements that are part of the same screen. So in this one, we'll use motion to transition between screens. Transitions like this will usually happen pretty often, and they require motion that's likely to take up the whole screen. Because they happen so regularly, it makes sense to keep these transitions pretty subtle. Large, complex transitions that happen really often can actually make your app seem slower, so it's important to consider how likely something is to happen and customize your interactions. If you have a huge success point that only happens once or twice, it definitely makes sense to celebrate that with more dramatic motion, but for repetitive page transitions, short, subtle animations can be a lot more successful. They'll give users a sense of where they are in the app without distracting from the tasks they're trying to accomplish. So first we'll look at the ideal solution for one of these page transitions. It'll be a pretty subtle transition that uses some of the techniques we've already looked at, but then we'll push it a bit further by going into some of the masking effects. For this transition, we'll start from the overview screen and then move to the subscription detail page. And we'll do that when someone clicks on the appropriate item on the sidebar. So for this one, our example is Netflix, so we'll select that whole sidebar item and then create an interaction connecting it to the subscription page. We want this to happen pretty quick since it is so common, so we'll set it to 0.3 and we'll set the delay to 0. And then we'll go to the timeline editor. You can see by default, we get a nice fade transition, and there's not too much we need to do to change that. We'll jump out of the timeline editor, and then we'll copy the main content from each of these screens over to the opposite one. So I'll copy overview and paste it over here, and then I'll select Netflix and paste it over here. If we look at the sidebar, we can see that the Netflix item is below the overview item, so we want to mimic that in the main content. So I'll move this down, and then turn the opacity to 0. And then here I'll select the overview, and turn the opacity of that one to 0 too. I'll make sure this is below the header as it moves out of the screen. And then we'll go back to the timeline. We'll auto-link since we have a couple new layers, and then we'll preview it at half speed. So for a transition that's happening pretty often like this is probably as much motion as we need. We have a little bit of personality from the bars on the left sliding, but then the actual content transition happens pretty quick and pretty smoothly. But let's see how we can make it a little more dramatic. I'll delete the Netflix group from the overview page because that's the one I'll be making some changes to. In this context, it'll be easier to just delete it and then reconnect it rather than having to copy all of the changes that we make. I'll delete the interaction also, and then we can move back to the subscription page. On the subscription page, I'll delete the overview, and then we can go in and make our changes. For this interaction, I really want to focus on these top picks. I want to pick out the top shows and movies that people might be really interested in. So I'll select all 4 of these, and then I'll paste them twice. I'll select the 3 copies of each one and mask them. And then I'll create a mask for each group of 3 and rename them. And then I want to add some color and some motion to each of these. First, I'll select the bottom layer of each group, and that's going to be our background layer. So we'll change that to a dark gray. And then our top layer of each one, that'll be a brief color overlay. So we'll choose the Netflix red. And then we want to move those all the way outside of the mask. And then finally, we'll select the middle layers. We want to unlock them so they can be resized. If I resize it right now, you can see how it crops, and that's the same effect we're going to be going for in our animation. Now everything is set up. I'll copy that, go back to the overview page, and then we'll move that back below. We'll copy the overview item, and then move that above. Turn the opacity down and move it back under header. And then before we turn this one to opacity 0, we want to make some of our changes. So I'll select that red layer, which is our top layer, and we'll move that to the opposite side. And then I'll take our image layer, which is the middle layer, and we want to give that just a 1 pixel width so we just see the background. That should be all set, so we'll change opacity to 0, and then we'll create our interaction again. This time we want it to last a bit longer, and so I'll put it at 1.5, and let's preview. If I zoom in on those items, you can see there's a bit of motion happening, but we want that to be really obvious. We want that to happen after this page loads in, and we want those animations to happen one after the other. So it will go House of Cards, Walking Dead, Planet Earth, and then Stranger Things. So I'll select all 4 of them and resize them so they're the same duration, and then I'll drag them out in the order that we want them to happen. If we preview that, you can see that the color and the transitions happen at the right time, but now this is moving as a separate element. We want it to keep moving with the rest of the elements. It's still connected to the rest of the content, we just want to call a bit more attention to it. There's not a really easy way to do this since we already modified all of the properties for these. So we'll open all of the folders, and then we'll view the properties for each individual layer, and we want to select the y-axis for all of them. And so we know there's 12 individual layers here, so I'll scroll through. I see 12 blue items selected, and then we'll drag them all to the left. So it's the same duration as the transition as a whole. If we jump back and hit play again, and now we'll zoom in just to check it out at a slower speed. It animates in, and then as it's mostly loaded in, then we get some secondary animation calling attention to that specific item. So now we have some both primary and secondary motion on these page transitions. It'll give someone a sense of where they are in the app, but it also gives a little bit of visual interest and calls attention to those specific items. That's it for full page transitions. In the next video, we'll be looking at creating parallax animations.